Hey, hi, hello, how you doing? For today's video, I want to talk about 5 things that I wish I knew as a beginner writer. There are so many crafts out there that the moment that you develop some form of a skill or become reasonably good at it, you wish that there were certain things that you knew when you first started. Writing is just one of those things, but there are so many things that I wish I knew at the time when I wrote my first book. When you first get into writing, there are so many things that you don't know, but if you did know them, would make it so much easier to just start and understand what you're doing. There are certain things that if I had known these things, I wouldn't have been nearly as insecure. I would have been much more sure of what I was writing and my identity as an author. So those are the things that we are going to be talking about today. So number 1 is something that most people who are experienced in writing will know, but many people who first start don't, and that is you don't need an expensive or a fancy writing software. If you look up online what published authors use in order to write, there are going to be certain writing softwares that pop up again and again and again. Scrivener, for example, being one of them. It is known that Scrivener is a very good writing program for a lot of writers who absolutely adore it and swear by it. I myself am one of those writers. It's great for if you are a planner, if you are a plotter, if you just want more organization in your writing in general. It can help you set deadlines. It can help you to stay organized. It has great editing tools as well. But while these things are incredibly fancy and sound really fun to work with, which they are, you do not need it in order to write a quality story or a book. Simply pen and paper is all that you need in order to write a story. We today have all of these programs, and because of that, a lot of people feel that this is what they need in order to become a good writer. They feel that it is a tool that is, once they start using it, going to amplify their writing and make it great. And while these programs indeed do have their perks, you don't need it at all. Your skill comes from within yourself and writing. A program as simple as Word, Google Docs, or again, just pen and paper are enough. People like Jane Austen and Charles Dickens did not have the software that we have today, and yet their books are still beloved by so many people around the world till this day, long after they are gone. When Stephen King first started writing, he did not have access to Scrivener, and yet he is one of the most adored authors in not just the horror genre, but even has made it onto the big screen. He is beloved with people who love horror in general, and he did not have access to Scrivener or any of these fancy writing programs that many beginner writers feel that they need. I wrote the first part of my book in Microsoft Word. From there, I found a program that was very similar to Scrivener, not the exact same. The difference was that it was a free version, and only then did I switch to Scrivener. But Microsoft Word is just as good as any other program. As long as your computer can handle it, there really is no reason other than personal preference to switch to something like Scrivener. Scrivener is not going to turn you all of a sudden into an amazing writer just because you downloaded it on your computer. Sure, it can help you plan and it can help you set a deadline, but you still have to write your story the same way as you would in MS Word or in Google Docs in order to become better. Number 2. Whether you're writing a short story or a full-length novel, you are never going to be 100% satisfied with your novel. Perfection is subjective. There is no specific thing that everybody in the world can agree on is 100% perfect. And that same thing goes for your novel. There's a reason that not a single book has 5 stars on Goodreads after 100,000 people have read it. For some, that book is their favorite book of all time, the best book that they have ever read, and for other people, it's the worst book that they have ever read, and they could never understand why anybody would love it. The same goes for you as an author. We especially are very critical of our own work because being critical allows us to see the mistakes in our writing and make it the best that it can be. The best that it can be, however, often gets confused with perfection, and that is often just something that you have to accept down the road. When I started editing my first novel, I decided that I would edit it to perfection. There was not going to be a single mistake in there. It was going to be absolutely perfect. And then I discovered that that was just simply not possible. No matter how many rounds of editing that I went through, no matter how many changes that I made, there were still tiny details that I was not 100% happy with. Your story ultimately tells you how it should be told as you build it. Your story will tell you what works and what doesn't, but sometimes that goes against personal preference. Also, just things like word choice can completely change how you view a certain sentence or a certain paragraph or a certain description. But sometimes the best word is just maybe not 100% what we're looking for. And that means that there are still going to be tiny imperfections throughout our story. The best that your book can be is not perfection. The best that it can be is that it is consistent, doesn't purely rely on tropes that are quite harmful, like women not being the smartest, men not being able to show emotion because it makes them weak. That you don't repeat a single word a million times to the point where just or only is the word that you use most in your whole book. That your book is formatted well and has good character depth. Those are the things that make your book a good book, but it still doesn't make it perfect. No book out there is perfect. And as a beginner writer, that can be very hard to accept. We look at the authors that we view to be amazing and perfection and this and that because they are our favorite authors and they are people that we look up to. So when we start our writing, we want to be like them. We want to be able to work to be just like those authors who inspire us on a daily basis and inspire us to write. But because we have this glorified version of them, when we start writing and see that really no story is 100% perfect and it is impossible to make a story perfect, we can get very disappointed and a lot of people actually get demotivated to write. I promise you that every single author, Stephen King, Charles Dickens, Jane Austen, all included, looked at their work at one point and said, it's the best that it can be, but I wish it was better. Every single writer, every single author, no matter whether you have been published or not, has looked at their work and thought the same thing. It is not abnormal to feel that your work could be better. I just finished a project and I still in the back of my head am like, maybe if I go in, I could make it even better. Just accepting that the book is good enough is a part of being a good writer. Knowing when the book is good enough is a part of what helps you grow. Your book doesn't need to be perfect. Your book just needs to be the story that you wish to tell. And the moment that it fits that criteria, you can stop. And you can allow yourself to be proud and be happy as you get closer and closer to that point. You don't need to achieve perfection. Number 3. You will cut 90% of what you wrote. Editing can be painful for many different reasons. And one of those reasons is that 90% of what you write, 90% of those words that you write down, you will ultimately delete. You will ultimately alter them. You will ultimately change them. Cut half of it. Write another paragraph elsewhere. It is normal to not be able to recognize your book by the time that you're done editing. If I had to go back to draft 1 of the book that I just finished writing and finished editing, those are 2 different stories, frankly. They are not the same story. I would not be able to recognize them as 2 drafts of the same story. And that's not only because I changed the title. It's because it went through so many rounds of editing that the story is just completely different. Half of the characters I ended up cutting. The characters that stayed got a complete overhaul in who they are as people and their goals and their motivations. And half of the main plot got either scrapped or changed so much throughout the course of these edits that, again, you wouldn't be able to recognize it. Your first draft is going to change to the point where you don't recognize it. I kind of look at it as renovating a house. When you start, so that's your draft 1, the house is in complete disarray. The wallpaper is coming off, windows are broken, the ceiling is slowly caving in, there may even be a hole in the ceiling. It is outdated, maybe a house from like the 1800s, and just looks like a complete mess. And by the time that you finish, the house is hyper modern, new windows, new doors, new floors, new ceilings, even new rooms that you added by taking down and placing new walls. You would not be able to recognize that it is the same house from 2 pictures next to each other. Writing is like renovating a house. You change it step by step into something that is basically unrecognizable. Your first draft is you discovering what the story even is. Whether you are a plotter or a pantser, I mean, you can plot as much as you want, but it's really when you start writing about these characters, experiencing the story from their point of view, that you truly discover what it is that you are writing about and what you truly want to write about. What makes a story enjoyable for you to write about? What are the parts that get you excited? And you're gonna hone in more on those than maybe you originally did in your planning. So when you write your first draft, it's an experiment. And you're gonna start perfecting it from there. And that means that your little prototype is gonna look nothing like your final draft. Ideas are gonna be scrapped. Whole chapters are going to disappear. And you're gonna end up with something else completely. My longest draft of the last book that I wrote was 175,000 words long. I cut 50,000 in just one draft. And along all of those drafts, draft 2 sat here, draft 3 sat there, 4 sat there, 5 sat there. I added and cut so much, and it is completely normal. It's also a pain in the ass, but I mean, we all chose to be writers. So we all chose that part of it as well. Number 4, and this is kind of controversial. Being a plotter does not necessarily make you a bad writer. Just to give an example, I am partially a planner, partially a plotter. I sit somewhere in the middle. It truly depends on what project I am writing. But the last book that I wrote, I didn't do any planning. I got the idea and impulsively started writing it and just never stopped. If I had to plan that novel and plot that novel, it very simply would not be existing right now. But the novel that I want to work on now is going to require more plotting. But that doesn't mean that one novel is going to end up turning out better than the other. There is no step-by-step guide on how to write properly because it is so based on personal preference and what works for us. It's the same as when you are studying. People study in different ways, and there is no one way to study. There are many methods that can help you depending on what you like in terms of your studying, but nothing works for everybody. And the same goes with plotting. There are people who like to have full outlines, make character sheets, who draw maps of whole locations within their story, and that's just apart from the world map that some people also like to create before they even get to their first draft. And then there are people who get the idea, grab their laptop, and just start typing. Both work, but it depends on the person. Now, I have possible suspected ADHD. One of the reasons that is I suspected, and some of my mental health team does as well, is I can be incredibly impulsive. Planning holds me back. I cannot sit there and plan out a story. There is absolutely no way. it does not help me, because to me it feels like my creativity is being limited to what I write down in my planning. Some people also panic when they go off of their outline, and that is something that I don't want to experience, because then I know I'm just gonna abandon the story. So I would much rather just dive in, have no clue what I'm doing, or barely any clue as to what I'm doing, and just see where ultimately I get. Whatever I write down, I can edit. And when I start editing, I get a better idea of what I'm doing. There is nothing wrong with being a pantser. And there is nothing wrong with being a plotter. Plotting does not mean that you're overcomplicating things, and being a pantser does not mean that you're lazy. There is such a big divide in the writing community as to whether being a pantser makes you a bad writer. And really, at the end of the day, no matter what anyone says, it doesn't matter. If it works for you, then that's what counts. It doesn't matter whether some Reddit user says that you're a bad writer because you are a pantser. I have no clue whether most of these books on my shelf are written by authors who are planners or plotters. I don't look up with every single new author that I discover whether they plotted the book or not. I just read it and decide if I enjoy it from there. Stephen King is one of the biggest pantsers out there. He doesn't plan his books at all. And he's the master of horror. And yet there are people out there who will still insist that pantsing a story makes you a bad writer. It really doesn't. It just means that you write differently from someone else, and there will always be people who do not like that. For them, it's either their way or the highway, and those are the people that you genuinely just need to ignore, especially with something like writing, where there is a lot of competition, and a lot of people make competition where there is none. And then the last thing that I wish that I knew is actually a bit more practical, and that is that when you're writing a story, you're writing about a person's experience, not just an event. Now, what do I mean by that? I have made this point before in a previous video, and that is that different people will react differently to the same situation. Person A and person B will not have the same reaction in a crisis situation. What is a great situation for person A may be a horrible situation for person B. So that means that when you are writing a book, you're writing the plot, you have to look more at how your character reacts to it than how you would react to it. Because there is no one way to react to one situation. Focus on your character's experience over what the general person would do, or what you imagine the majority of people would do in a certain situation. Every person is unique, and so is every single character that you will write, no matter how many stories you write. Whether it is a short story, a novella, or a full-on novel, every single character will be different from each other, even if that is in small ways. Even people that you may feel are the exact same person are still going to think slightly different. The way that people react to situations depends on so many different things that you can't just take a situation without looking at who you put in the situation and decide how it's going to go. You need to know your character, put them in that situation, and start testing out as you are writing their reactions, what they do, what they think, and decide from there whether it fits or not. A series of events is not what makes a unique book. It is how your cast of characters reacts to it and how they as a group face it together as well as individually. You're going to want to look at their coping mechanisms. You're going to want to look at their history. You're going to want to look at their motivation. Each of these things is going to be different, and each of these things means that your character is going to react differently no matter what from the next person. And the 8 billion people that currently live on Earth, everybody is going to react differently to a certain situation, your characters included. Look at their reactions and base your book on those reactions and how your character would react. If you find that your character and your plot knock heads, then maybe you need to change something in your character or you need to change something in your plot. But don't try to force it. Your character and your plot, so the events of the book, need to work together rather than knock heads. That is what creates a good book, and not just the plot only. It's more than just the events of the book and the high stakes scenes and the big battle at the end. You're writing about more than just the big climax. And you're gonna want to keep that in mind as you write. And these were 5 things that I wish that I knew when I first started writing. I hope that these tips were helpful. I hope that it helps you to feel a bit more confident in your writing if you are a beginner writer. It takes time, but I promise you, you will get better at it. You will grow in your craft. You will grow more confident. And just enjoy the journey as you get there. Just don't worry about what other people say. Just allow yourself to experience it, and please just have fun. If you found this video helpful, please consider subscribing and liking this video. If you have any requests as to what you would like for me to make next, leave those in the comments down below, and then I will see you next week. Bye bye!